Welcome back to Be Great Economics. This is Nate, your class leader. Let's get started. So, today is going to have two simple slides: inflationary spiral, deflationary spiral. These are rather contentious issues that we see people writing about a lot, commentating on, about how we can be going into an inflationary spiral or a wage price spiral, how we can be going into a deflationary spiral as we head into a potential market crash or recession. What are these things? What do they mean? And I'm going to show you also how there's a little bit of an exaggeration using an economic model that's meant to show a method of operation without necessarily all the inputs and outputs, and how that can be flawed in making automatic assumptions based off these models. So the inflationary or wage price spiral, as it's professionally called, is a very simple model. It's simply that an increase in prices of goods leads to an increase in wages because of higher demand for wages because of the increase in goods, which leads to increased prices of goods and services, which then leads to the same cycle over and over. Now, most people assume that this is automatically infinite, right? That an inflationary price spiral or wage price spiral will just continue on where prices get higher and higher and higher. However, there's a flaw in following this logic. Now, the reason why people would think that an inflationary price spiral or wage price spiral would continue forever is because ultimately all supplies are limited, but we use a fractional reserve banking system that causes money supply to be able to be increased. And since an economy is effectively operating with a set amount of goods and services that can increase or decrease based off of productivity within a range of capable productivity, and you have a limited amount of money supply, and they essentially equal each other. But there's a Cantillon effect causes different valuations and different things at different times. So it doesn't just apply to currency, but it applies to almost all goods and services. And what we find is that in this model, it seems infinite. It seems as though it never stops. Because let's say it's on housing prices. I, a wealthy person, go and buy a house, but then I also take a loan against my house and go buy another house. I've now decreased the supply of goods, of available goods in the system, but I have increased the currency supply because of fractional reserve banking. I have shorted the dollar and gone long on house. I've bet that the house will go up against the dollar over time, and that my interest rate, which is the other thing to consider here, the interest rate is serviceable. So if I continue to do that, I can keep getting renters because the price of all houses will continue to climb, which then causes a inflationary spiral. But since the prices of the houses go up, so do the cost of the wages of all the workers that need housing. Since that continues, eventually the cost of all the things that I purchase also go up. Now, the limitation here is obviously in a limitation of other goods and services and supplies. Now, if the money supply can continue on infinitely, then this can continue infinitely. Because if we continue to have access to the money that can provide the goods, the pay and wages to the workers, then we ultimately will continue on this cycle. But most companies are doing that through a form of servicing debt. If they cannot reach a certain number of customers, then they have excess supply, which then leads to deflation. So in a model, it shows you how the inflationary wage price spiral works, but it doesn't show you how the interactions occur within that model. Now, if we end up on, let's say we're on one right now, inflationary wage price spiral, where we've seen wages increase, but they haven't met up to the inflation rate yet. Currently, the inflation is stated as 6.8% consumer price index, but wages are approximately 4.9% increase year over year. What does that mean? It means that there's still more gas in the tank for the increase in the cost of production, but the cost of production is already up because producer price indexes are around 8%. So if we're seeing producer costs increase and we're seeing wages increase, that will feed producer costs, and that can set off this inflation spiral. However, again, you run out of people who can and want to buy your goods and services. You run out of enough legroom in the servicing of your debt. Let's say the Federal Reserve hikes rates as a method of trying to control this. They hike rates to where they're no longer serviceable, and then defaulting happens. If defaulting happens, we go into a deflationary spiral. If you run out of people to sell to, you then have to lower the prices of your goods, and it cuts off there as well, unless you continue the money supply going to the people, which then increases the purchasing of goods and services. So ultimately, productivity is a limitation, money supply is a limitation, and demand is a limitation. All of these things are factors that have to play out. And so claiming that it's automatically infinite is a little flawed because money supply times velocity equals price yield, but that velocity has a limit because we can only produce so much so fast based off demand. We're constantly trying to exceed demand and create excess because if I am a producer, I want to offer, because everybody else out there wants a cheaper price. We all want to pay less for something. If I am a producer, I want to offer something of more value for less. So I want to get all the customers that somebody else doesn't have. So if Apple is selling iPhones really expensively, I can make an Android phone that is much cheaper. But Apple's proposing that it has more value because it is an Apple product and it has a certain quality and expectation of, hey, it has the little Apple logo. So productivity and inflation kind of have a play back and forth on how this leads to a wage price spiral. If the money supply can continue to increase, we can see these spirals continue and the rate of inflation stay a little more constant. If there is no increase in the money supply, the rate has to stop. We may see inflation stay because we have productivity up and we have demand up and we have supply at a fixed rate or approximately meeting the same rate, but we won't necessarily see an increase in the rate of inflation. And that might be how inflation can be transitory if the goods and services can be met and we just see sustained inflation or holding the prices over time. So that's going to bring me to my deflationary spiral, my wage price spiral. This one's also very simplistic. There's a couple extra points here because it includes companies defaulting, but basically prices continue to fall. Let's say I'm a producer of houses and I make excess houses. So now I can sell them at a lower rate. I'm making more profit than my competitors. My competitors try to lower their rates as well in order to meet the demand for a cheaper house. But they can't do that because they have taken on excess debt. And so that excess debt causes them to default, which then causes them to lay off workers, which then causes the workers who they and their second, third order effect of other companies that are related to those companies now can no longer afford houses. And so I have to lower my prices even more to meet demand, and then I default on my debt. Now, the spiral of just constantly everybody going unemployed kind of doesn't really play out in real life. The spirals just show how the spiral goes, but it doesn't necessarily say that it's infinite. The infinity loop here is that ultimately it has to do with policy. Government policy has a tendency to perpetuate a deflationary spiral because of a lack of confidence. If you have confidence in the economy, whenever we have a deflationary run, we suddenly see a spring up in recovery. But if you have sustained deflationary effects and you see sustained lack of growth, what is that? That's the deflationary spiral. But once you've washed out all the debt and you have people who are holding wealth because wealth is effectively transferred, both of these methods are effectively just a transfer of wealth. It is a revaluation of a good or service. In the case of a wage price spiral, it is the revaluation of goods and services against the money supply. In a deflationary spiral, it's the valuation of money against the debt that purchased the goods and services. So once we wash out all the debt, what's left? It's just currency and the goods and services. So if there's confidence in the system, then it can resume. Being unable to instill confidence is more a problem than anything else. And this is how the human nature function applies. Deflationary spirals are well documented throughout history, but one of the flaws in making an assumption about a deflationary spiral is that it's infinite, because deflationary spirals have never been infinite. We have always gone up over time. The places where deflationary spirals have a lasting long-term effect of just constantly lower prices and goods and services, ultimately it leads to a lack of goods and services to meet the demand, and then you get a price spike anyways, and so now everything's expensive, right? So the productivity to offer something at a lower cost shows up. The history of this includes from 1867 in the United States to 1910 to show that we had a deflationary economy. Prices were constantly falling, and the value of the gold supply at the time was constantly going up. We were producing more than we've ever produced in history compared to our total GDP. Why did we have a deflationary spiral and we didn't have constant default on debt? Because companies weren't very heavy on debt. The productivity came from the Industrial Revolution. So one of the flaws in thinking that a limited currency supply automatically leads to a deflationary spiral is a little mistaken, because people manage the risk based off of the rate and ability to manage the risk against the debt that they hold. If they can't manage the risk appropriately against the debt, that is part of the business cycle. The inflationary run on debt, where companies expect to make profit, and then the defaulting begins and you go back down. Now, the recovery in this, as long as the policy doesn't change or the expectations don't change, then we will resume accordingly. So saying that a deflationary spiral is infinite is the same problem with saying that an inflationary spiral is infinite. It discounts policy and human action, right? Policy is human action. So I just wanted to highlight a quote from Milton Friedman, and it's, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon in the sense that it is and can be produced only by a more rapid increase in the quantity of money than input. And so again, that comes to weighing goods and services against the money supply. And if you increase the money supply more than you increase the goods and services, you will see an increase in price. If you decrease the money supply against the goods and services, you will see a decrease in price, right? Because the value is just transferring between the two. And so these spirals are limited by, once they finish off either the defaulting or the productivity can no longer incline, it switches the other way. And so you go from a period of overvaluation and undervaluation of one asset to the other, or one asset class productivity versus the money supply. So I hope that clears some things up. And know that it doesn't explain to you what's happening, what's going to happen. But what it does tell you is that these are how these spirals perpetuate, and how they're also not infinite. They're inherently not infinite. Human beings do not function in an infinite manner against this, but the mania of crowds does lead to parabolic rises temporarily in these events. It is only permanent if you permanently increase the money supply. So thanks for watching. I hope to see you again. And I will be making more videos on predictions, expectations, and outcomes, as well as basic economics.